Imagine discovering that the most intimate aspects of human existence, whom you could love, how you could express that love, when and where you could consummate relationships, and even the positions your body could assume during the most private moments of physical connection, were not personal choices, but matters of state law, regulated with the same meticulous detail that governments applied to taxation, military service, and public order. This was the reality of ancient civilizations, where sex and marriage were never private matters, but instruments of political control, economic manipulation, and social engineering that transformed the bedroom into a battleground where individual desire met the crushing weight of state authority and religious orthodoxy. From the ziggurats of Mesopotamia to the marble halls of Rome, from the papyrus scrolls of Egypt to the stone tablets of Judea, lawmakers crafted elaborate legal codes that penetrated the most intimate spaces of human experience, with regulations so comprehensive and invasive that modern minds struggle to comprehend how thoroughly ancient societies colonized human sexuality in service of power, property, and the perpetuation of hierarchies that depended on controlling reproduction, inheritance, and the very definition of legitimate human connection. These were not the familiar moral teachings found in religious texts or the social customs passed down through generations, but systematic legal frameworks that transformed love into contract, pleasure into crime, and marriage into a form of regulated commerce, where human bodies became commodities to be traded, controlled, and exploited through laws that claimed divine authority while serving distinctly earthly purposes of wealth concentration, political stability, and the maintenance of social orders that required the systematic subordination of human desire to institutional need. The Mesopotamian marriage laws established some of history's most complex and invasive regulations governing sexual relationships, creating comprehensive legal systems that treated marriage not as personal commitment, but as commercial transaction requiring detailed contracts. Extensive negotiations and ongoing legal supervision by authorities who monitored compliance with elaborate rules governing everything from wedding ceremonies to divorce procedures to the sexual obligations of married parties. The Code of Hammurabi contained over 30 provisions, specifically addressing marriage and sexual behavior, including detailed regulations governing bride prices, dowry arrangements, adultery punishments, and the rights of husbands to discipline wives who failed to fulfill their contractual obligations for sexual availability, household management, and child production. Women entering marriage were required to transfer legal ownership of their bodies to their husbands through formal ceremonies that included public declarations of sexual submission, while men acquired not only sexual rights, but legal authority to control their wives' movements, associations, economic activities, and reproductive decisions. The law recognized multiple categories of wives within single households: primary wives with full legal status, secondary wives with limited rights, and concubines with minimal legal protection, creating hierarchical systems of sexual access that reflected and reinforced broader social stratification, while ensuring that wealthy men could maintain multiple sexual relationships under legal protection. Divorce laws heavily favored male interests, while creating nearly insurmountable barriers for women seeking to escape unwanted marriages requiring proof of extreme misconduct that was difficult to establish in legal systems that discounted female testimony while granting extensive credibility to male witnesses and authorities. The legal system developed elaborate procedures for investigating sexual misconduct, including requirements for witnesses to adultery, detailed interrogation of accused parties, and physical examinations to determine virginity, pregnancy, and evidence of sexual activity, transforming private behavior into public legal proceedings that destroyed privacy while claiming to protect marriage and social order. Punishments for sexual violations ranged from financial penalties and public humiliation to mutilation, exile, and execution, with women facing systematically harsher consequences than men for identical behavior while being held responsible for male sexual misconduct that occurred without their consent or against their will. The Egyptian sexual regulations created sophisticated legal frameworks that governed not only marriage relationships, but also regulated sexual behavior, gender roles, and reproductive practices with detailed provisions that reflected the complex social hierarchies and religious beliefs that structured ancient Egyptian civilization. Egyptian law recognized multiple forms of marriage, including formal ceremonies for wealthy couples, informal unions for common people, and temporary marriages for specific purposes like business partnerships or religious obligations, creating flexible systems that served different social and economic functions while maintaining legal control over sexual relationships. The legal system included detailed provisions governing incestuous relationships that were forbidden for common people, but required for royal families, creating dual standards that reinforced political hierarchies while demonstrating the arbitrary nature of sexual regulations that served power rather than consistent moral principles. Women in ancient Egypt enjoyed relatively greater legal rights than their counterparts in other ancient civilizations, including the ability to initiate divorce proceedings, own property independently of their husbands, and engage in business activities. But these rights were still subject to extensive male supervision and could be revoked through legal procedures that favored patriarchal authority. Egyptian sexual laws included detailed regulations governing prostitution, homosexual relationships, bestiality, and other forms of sexual behavior deemed inappropriate for different social classes, creating comprehensive systems of sexual regulation that penetrated all aspects of society while serving the interests of political and religious authorities. The legal system developed elaborate procedures for investigating sexual crimes, including adultery, rape, and sexual misconduct, requiring physical evidence, witness testimony, and religious rituals designed to determine guilt or innocence through supernatural intervention rather than objective legal standards. Punishments for sexual violations in Egyptian law ranged from financial penalties and social ostracism to physical mutilation and execution, with the severity of punishment determined by the social status of the parties involved rather than the nature of the offense, creating justice systems that reinforced social hierarchies through differential application of sexual regulations. The Greek sexual laws varied significantly between different city-states, but shared common features that regulated sexual behavior as a matter of civic duty and political participation, creating legal systems where sexual relationships were evaluated based on their contribution to military strength, political stability, and social order rather than personal fulfillment or individual choice. Athenian law developed elaborate distinctions between different categories of sexual relationships: marriage between citizens for reproduction, relationships with hetairai for pleasure and intellectual companionship, and sexual activity with slaves for immediate gratification, creating hierarchical systems that served political functions while regulating access to different forms of sexual experience based on social status and civic participation. Spartan sexual laws included provisions requiring married couples to engage in sexual activity, designed to produce strong warriors, regulating the timing and frequency of sexual encounters to optimize reproductive outcomes, and permitting older men to share their wives with younger men to ensure maximum fertility and genetic diversity in the warrior class. Greek legal systems developed comprehensive regulations governing homosexual relationships, particularly between adult men and adolescent boys, creating elaborate rules governing appropriate age differences, proper conduct, gift-giving, and the transition from sexual relationships to mentorship and civic responsibility. The law included detailed provisions governing adultery that focused primarily on protecting male property rights in their wives' sexuality rather than moral concerns about sexual faithfulness, creating legal systems where adultery was prosecuted as theft of sexual services rather than violation of marriage vows or emotional commitment. Greek sexual regulations extended to public behavior, dress codes, and social interaction between men and women, creating comprehensive systems of gender segregation and behavioral control that served political purposes while claiming to protect civic virtue and social stability. Punishments for sexual violations in Greek law included financial penalties, loss of citizenship rights, social ostracism, and, in extreme cases, physical punishment or exile. With the severity of consequences determined by the political impact of sexual misconduct rather than moral considerations or personal harm to individuals involved. The Roman sexual legislation represented perhaps history's most systematic attempt to regulate human sexuality through legal mechanisms, creating comprehensive frameworks that governed marriage, divorce, adultery, homosexuality, prostitution, and virtually every aspect of sexual behavior, with detailed provisions that served the political and economic interests of the Roman state. The Lex Julia de Adulteriis criminalized adultery as a public offense against the state, rather than a private matter between married couples, creating the first comprehensive system of state prosecution for sexual misconduct, while exempting men from prosecution for relationships with unmarried women slaves and prostitutes. Roman marriage law required formal ceremonies, witness testimony, and legal documentation that transformed personal relationships into contractual obligations supervised by state authorities who monitored compliance with detailed regulations governing sexual behavior, financial arrangements, and reproductive responsibilities. The legal system developed elaborate procedures for investigating sexual crimes, including requirements for physical evidence, witness testimony, and formal accusations that created public spectacles of private behavior while serving political purposes of social control and elite competition. Roman law included detailed provisions governing divorce that allowed men to dissolve marriages for virtually any reason, while creating significant barriers for women seeking to end unwanted relationships, including requirements for male guardian approval and forfeiture of property and children to former husbands. The legal system recognized different categories of sexual relationships, including legitimate marriage between citizens, concubinage for relationships that did not meet marriage requirements, and various forms of temporary sexual arrangements that served specific social and economic functions, while maintaining legal control over reproduction and inheritance. Punishments for sexual violations in Roman law included financial penalties, property confiscation, exile, loss of citizenship rights, and in extreme cases, execution, with women facing systematically harsher consequences than men while being held responsible for sexual misconduct that occurred without their consent or control. The Jewish sexual laws, as codified in biblical and rabbinical sources, created comprehensive religious and legal frameworks that regulated sexual behavior as a matter of covenant relationship with God, rather than solely civic obligation, creating systems that penetrated private life with unprecedented detail, while claiming divine authority for regulations that served obvious social and political purposes. The Mosaic Law included detailed provisions governing marriage arrangements, sexual prohibitions, ritual purity requirements, and reproductive obligations that created comprehensive systems of behavioral control while serving the political needs of maintaining distinct ethnic and religious identity in hostile political environments. Jewish sexual regulations included elaborate systems of ritual purity that regulated sexual activity based on menstrual cycles, pregnancy, childbirth, and other biological functions, creating legal requirements that transformed natural bodily processes into occasions for religious obligation and community supervision. The legal system developed detailed procedures for investigating sexual misconduct, including requirements for multiple witnesses, elaborate trial procedures, and severe punishments, including stoning, exile, and social ostracism that served community control functions, while claiming divine authorization for obviously human legal innovations. Jewish marriage law included provisions for arranged marriages, bride prices, divorce procedures, and levirate marriage that required widows to marry their deceased husband's brothers, creating systems that served economic and political functions, while claiming religious justification for regulations that subordinated individual choice to community interest. The law included comprehensive prohibitions against various forms of sexual behavior, including adultery, homosexuality, bestiality, and incest, with detailed definitions and severe punishments that created extensive systems of behavioral monitoring and social control disguised as religious obligation. Rabbinical interpretations of biblical sexual law expanded these regulations into minute details of daily life, creating elaborate systems of religious supervision that governed not only sexual behavior, but also dress, diet, social interaction, and virtually every aspect of personal conduct that might have sexual implications or significance. The Persian sexual regulations under the Sassanid dynasty created sophisticated legal systems that integrated Zoroastrian religious principles with administrative needs of governing diverse populations, resulting in complex regulations that varied based on religious affiliation, social status, and regional customs, while maintaining centralized control over marriage and sexual behavior. Persian law recognized multiple forms of marriage, including temporary marriages for specific purposes, trial marriages that could be dissolved after probationary periods, and complex polygamous arrangements that served political and economic functions while maintaining legal supervision over sexual relationships and reproductive outcomes. The legal system included detailed provisions governing sexual behavior between different religious communities, creating elaborate rules for intermarriage, conversion, and the religious status of children from mixed relationships that served political purposes of maintaining social boundaries while preventing religious contamination. Persian sexual laws included comprehensive regulations governing Zoroastrian priests and religious practitioners, creating elaborate requirements for sexual purity, marriage restrictions, and reproductive obligations that served religious functions while maintaining political control over influential clerical classes. The law developed detailed procedures for investigating sexual misconduct that combined religious ritual with legal investigation, creating systems that claimed divine authority while serving obvious political purposes of social control and elite manipulation. Punishments for sexual violations in Persian law varied based on religious affiliation and social status, creating hierarchical justice systems that reinforced political authority while claiming religious justification for differential treatment of sexual misconduct based on social position rather than moral considerations. The economic functions of ancient sexual regulations reveal how marriage and sexual laws primarily served purposes of property control, inheritance management, and wealth concentration, rather than moral instruction or personal fulfillment, creating legal systems that transformed human sexuality into mechanisms of economic manipulation and social control. Ancient societies used marriage laws to control the transfer of property between generations, ensuring that wealth remained within appropriate social groups, while preventing economic mobility that might threaten established hierarchies through regulations that appeared to govern sexual behavior while actually controlling economic relationships. Bride prices, dowries, and other financial arrangements associated with marriage created markets in human sexuality where women's sexual and reproductive capacity became commodities to be bought, sold and traded according to economic calculations rather than personal preference or emotional attachment. The legal systems developed elaborate mechanisms for controlling inheritance through regulations governing legitimate versus illegitimate children, creating financial incentives for strict control over female sexuality, while ensuring that property passed to male heirs who would maintain existing social and economic arrangements. Divorce laws often included provisions for property division that favored male interests, while ensuring that women who left marriages faced economic destruction, creating powerful financial incentives for remaining in unwanted relationships while serving economic interests of maintaining stable property arrangements. The social control mechanisms embedded in ancient sexual laws created comprehensive systems for monitoring and regulating human behavior that extended far beyond sexual activity to encompass virtually all aspects of social interaction, creating frameworks of surveillance and control that maintained political stability while claiming moral or religious authority. Ancient societies used sexual regulations to maintain social boundaries between different classes, ethnic groups, and religious communities, creating legal barriers to intermarriage and sexual relationships that might threaten established social hierarchies or political arrangements. The public nature of marriage ceremonies, divorce proceedings, and sexual misconduct trials created opportunities for community participation in individual punishment, while reinforcing social norms through spectacular demonstrations of the consequences of violating sexual regulations. Legal systems developed elaborate networks of informants, witnesses, and officials responsible for monitoring sexual behavior, creating climates of surveillance and mutual suspicion that served political control functions while claiming to protect public morality and social order. The gender-based discrimination, inherent in ancient sexual laws, reveals the systematic use of legal mechanisms to maintain male authority and female subordination through regulations that appeared to govern sexual behavior, while actually controlling economic opportunities, social participation, and political power. Women faced systematically harsher punishments than men for identical sexual behavior, while being held responsible for male sexual misconduct and denied legal mechanisms for self-defense or protection from unwanted sexual attention or violence. Ancient legal systems created comprehensive barriers to female economic independence, political participation, and social authority through sexual regulations that restricted women's movement, association, and economic activities while claiming moral justification for obviously political restrictions. The laws governing female sexuality were designed to ensure male control over reproduction, inheritance, and family formation, while preventing women from developing independent sources of power, wealth, or social authority that might challenge patriarchal dominance. The religious manipulation of sexual regulations demonstrates how ancient authorities used claims of divine authority to legitimize legal systems that served obvious political and economic purposes, while creating frameworks of moral obligation that made resistance appear to be rebellion against supernatural rather than human authority. Religious authorities developed elaborate theological justifications for sexual regulations that transformed arbitrary political decisions into divine commandments, creating systems of moral obligation that served institutional interests while claiming supernatural authorization for obviously human legal innovations. The integration of religious ritual with legal procedure in sexual misconduct cases created powerful psychological mechanisms for social control, as individuals who violated sexual regulations faced not only legal punishment, but spiritual condemnation that extended beyond earthly consequences to include supernatural retaliation. Ancient societies used religious festivals, ceremonies, and observances related to sexuality and marriage to reinforce social norms, while providing opportunities for community surveillance and control of individual behavior through apparently voluntary participation in religious activities. The international trade in sexual services regulated by ancient legal systems reveals how governments systematically profited from human sexuality through taxation, licensing, and regulation of prostitution, while maintaining moral frameworks that condemned sexual behavior they simultaneously exploited for revenue generation. Ancient societies developed elaborate legal distinctions between different categories of sexual commerce: temple prostitution for religious purposes, licensed brothels for recreational activity, and private arrangements for elite consumption, creating hierarchical systems that serve different political and economic functions while maintaining legal control over sexual markets. The regulation of international movement of people for sexual purposes created early forms of human trafficking law that served state interests in controlling population movement while generating revenue from sexual commerce that authorities simultaneously condemned as morally corrupt. Legal systems developed complex procedures for taxation and regulation of sexual services that required detailed record-keeping, official licensing, and regular inspection, creating bureaucratic mechanisms that transformed sexual activity into sources of government revenue, while maintaining moral frameworks that justified ongoing regulation and control. The modern legacy of ancient sexual regulations can be seen in contemporary legal systems that continue to regulate sexual behavior, marriage arrangements, and reproductive choices through mechanisms that serve political and economic interests, while claiming moral authority for restrictions that primarily benefit institutional power rather than individual welfare or social stability. Contemporary marriage laws, divorce regulations, and sexual misconduct statutes often reflect ancient priorities of property control, social boundary maintenance, and political manipulation, rather than genuine concerns for personal welfare, individual rights, or social justice that supposedly motivate modern legal systems. The persistence of gender-based discrimination in contemporary sexual regulations demonstrates the enduring influence of ancient legal frameworks that subordinated individual choice to institutional control while creating systematic disadvantages for women that continue to shape legal and social systems across cultures. Understanding the political and economic functions of ancient sexual laws provides crucial insight into contemporary legal systems that continue to regulate intimate behavior while claiming moral authority for restrictions that primarily serve institutional interests rather than individual welfare or genuine social needs. As you contemplate these comprehensive systems of ancient sexual regulation that transformed the most intimate aspects of human experience into matters of state control and legal supervision, consider how many contemporary restrictions on sexual behavior, marriage arrangements, and reproductive choices serve similar functions of political control and economic manipulation, while claiming moral authority for regulations that primarily benefit institutional power. The ancient experience with sexual regulation demonstrates that legal control over intimate behavior has always served purposes of social hierarchy, maintenance, economic control, and political manipulation, rather than genuine moral instruction or individual welfare, revealing patterns that continue to influence contemporary legal and social systems. If this exploration of ancient sexual regulations has revealed patterns of institutional control over intimate behavior that extend beyond historical contexts into contemporary legal and social restrictions, share your insights, subscribe for more investigations into the political functions of moral regulation, and remember that understanding historical precedents provides essential knowledge for recognizing how legal systems continue to colonize intimate behavior in service of institutional rather than individual interests. Would you have recognized the political and economic motivations behind ancient sexual laws while living under their comprehensive regulation of intimate behavior? Or would you have accepted moral and religious justifications for legal systems that primarily served institutional control rather than genuine protection of individual welfare or social stability?